Small states along the eastern coast of America could stretch into a great power spanning from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Have you ever thought that there could exist an idea that made millions of people believe they had a sacred mission chosen by God to conquer an entire continent? That is the story of manifest destiny, also called the obvious fate, a concept that carried the color of religious faith, was the flame of nationalism, and at the same time the justification for unlimited expansion ambition. We often know the United States as a land of freedom, of opportunity, where anyone can start over and rise from nothing. But behind that American dream is a chapter of history full of blood and tears. Behind the wagons rolling westward were separations, cultures erased, native communities losing their homelands, and endless wars. When Americans called it destiny, did they ever ask themselves about the destiny of those who were forced to abandon the very land of their ancestors? Imagine you were living at the beginning of the 19th century. You are a poor farmer. Land in the east is becoming more crowded, opportunities fewer. A call rings out that on the other side of the mountains, beyond the great rivers, there are fertile fields stretching endlessly. There is gold, there is opportunity, there is freedom. What will you do? Will you stay with the barren land or risk your life to step into a journey with no clear destination? Hundreds of thousands of Americans chose to step forward. They called it courage, aspiration. But for those already living on that land, it was invasion, a nightmare they could not escape. Manifest destiny was not just a political slogan. It was a belief spreading into every family, every community, and became a powerful force driving this young nation to expand its territory at an unprecedented pace. That very belief led to the purchase of Louisiana from France, the taking of Texas from Mexico, the signing of unequal treaties with native tribes, and finally stretching the territory all the way to the Pacific coast. Every step of expansion was praised as a victory of civilization, but at the same time also a grave burying native cultures. So the question arises, can a nation build its dream on the pain of others? Was manifest destiny the light of hope or the shadow of ambition? That is exactly what we will explore together in today's journey. Before we begin, I want to hear your thoughts. When you hear the phrase manifest destiny, what comes to your mind? A great dream or a tragedy dressed in the robe of ideals? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the US History channel to continue with me on the journey of discovering dramatic and unexpected stories of American history. When we look back at the history of the United States, it is hard to believe that a nation that began with only 13 small colonies along the Atlantic coast could stretch all the way to the Pacific coast in just a few decades. The question is, what drove that rapid expansion? Was it simply the desire to seek fertile land, trade opportunities, or the rich resources of the West? Or was there a deeper belief, an idea deeply rooted in the minds of Americans that they had a sacred, predetermined mission? That idea was called manifest destiny, also known as obvious fate. The phrase manifest destiny first appeared in 1845, used by journalist John L. O'Sullivan in an article to justify that the United States should annex Texas. In the article, he argued that the expansion of territory across the entire North American continent was the obvious fate of Americans. O'Sullivan believed that God had given the United States a sacred mission to spread freedom, democracy, and civilization to all new lands. Interestingly, at that time, the phrase manifest destiny was not clearly defined, but it quickly spread widely and became the slogan for an entire generation. Why was this idea so appealing? To understand, we must go back to the first decades after the United States gained independence. When the Declaration of Independence was announced in 1776, Americans believed they had not simply broken free from British rule. They also believed they were beginning a great experiment in democracy and freedom never before seen in human history. This young nation saw itself as a model for the world to learn from. And if it was a model, why not expand to spread that model to other lands? From this very root, manifest destiny found fertile ground to grow. In the early 19th century, Americans witnessed rapid population growth. From a few million, the population of the United States rose to tens of millions in just a few decades. Lands in the East gradually became crowded, and many families began to think about finding new land to settle. In the West, vast fields, wide prairies, and untapped resources seemed to be waiting for them. Manifest destiny became the perfect justification for that aspiration. People believed that not only out of the need to survive, but that God Himself had granted them the right to expand. Manifest destiny was also strongly influenced by religion. The United States, from its birth, carried within it the spirit of the Puritans who had migrated from Europe. They always believed they were God's chosen people, given a special mission. When they set foot in the New World, they saw it as the Promised Land. And now, with manifest destiny, they believed that Promised Land must stretch all the way to the western coast. This religious thought made expansion not just a material need, but also a sacred duty, an act of obedience to God. But not everyone agreed with that idea. From the time manifest destiny began to be mentioned, many politicians and intellectuals questioned it. Was it truly right for a nation to give itself the right to expand without regard for the peoples who had lived on that land for centuries? Was it fair to use religious faith to justify wars and unequal treaties? Those debates continue to this day, as historians still discuss the true meaning of manifest destiny. One notable point is that manifest destiny was not always simply about territorial expansion. It was also used to justify many U.S. foreign policies and wars. When America looked toward Mexico, toward Cuba, even toward lands in the Pacific, many argued that this too was part of the obvious fate. In other words, manifest destiny gradually became a political tool to promote expansionism. To see the spread of this idea, imagine the scenes of the 1830s and 1840s. Wagon trains followed one another westward, crossing prairies, climbing the treacherous Rocky Mountains, and stopping in new lands. In their minds, that journey was not just a migration, it was the fulfillment of a mission the whole nation believed in. And when thousands of families shared that belief, manifest destiny became an unstoppable force. John L. O'Sullivan, the man who coined the phrase, could not have imagined that a single article of his would help shape an entire historical era. Interestingly, at first, manifest destiny had no official definition. It was vague, flexible, open to many interpretations. But it was precisely this vagueness that made it easily accepted. Anyone could find in manifest destiny a reason to justify their actions. For farmers, it was the right to land. For politicians, it was national strategy. For the religious, it was a command from God. Manifest destiny was also tied to American nationalism. After the War of Independence, the United States longed to assert its place before the world. Territorial expansion became proof of the strength and limitless potential of this young nation. Each new territory added to the map was not just miles of land, but a symbol of growth. As Americans looked at an ever-expanding map, they felt they were truly accomplishing something great, something beyond the reach of any other nation. However, behind that glitter were painful stories. Manifest destiny gave land to some,
but took away homelands from others. Native tribes who had lived on that land for thousands of years suddenly became the invaded. To them, manifest destiny was not obvious fate, but obvious curse. And that was the greatest tragedy of this historical era. When we talk about the origins of manifest destiny, we are not just talking about a concept written on paper. We are talking about a belief, a powerful urge deeply rooted in the American mind that made them willing to cross mountains, cross deserts, willing to fight, and even willing to sacrifice to fulfill that mission. Manifest destiny was not the policy of a single administration. It was a shared spirit, a national drive, and perhaps also one of the most controversial ideals in the entire history of the United States. Therefore, when mentioning manifest destiny, we must look at it from many angles. It was both a belief that helped this nation expand and grow, and an excuse to justify ambitious actions. It was both a light that guided millions in search of the promised land, and a darkness that engulfed cultures swept away in the storm of history. And the question is, can we judge manifest destiny with just one word, right or wrong? Or was it a complex historical reality containing both hope and tragedy, both ideals and ambition? The origin of manifest destiny was the intersection of religious faith, the desire for freedom, and expansionist ambition. It began with a small article by a journalist, but quickly became the driving force of an entire people. It came from practical needs for land and opportunity, but wore the robe of a sacred mission. And that is what made manifest destiny one of the most powerful ideas in the history of the United States.
18th century, when America was still a young nation, the idea of moving westward had already begun to form in the minds of many people. The western lands were still an unknown. Maps were incomplete. Mountain ranges, rivers, and vast prairies remained mysteries. But it was precisely that mystery that sparked curiosity, ambition, and the belief that a new opportunity awaited there. Imagine yourself as a farming family living in Virginia or Pennsylvania in the late 18th century. Land along the coast had gradually become crowded, the population was growing, and the chance to own farmland became harder. Young people looked toward the distant horizon, where the sun set, and believed that there they would find a new land to start over. They were not only seeking land to cultivate, but also seeking freedom, a life not bound by old social orders. The first migrations happened sporadically. A few families, a few small groups, followed major rivers or crossed dense forests to move deeper inland. But from the early 19th century, this movement became a wave. That wave was driven by two important factors. First was the belief in manifest destiny, the belief that Americans had a mission to spread across the continent. Second was economic need, since the western land was vast, fertile, and seemingly endless. Legendary trails were born in that context. The Oregon Trail, one of the most famous routes, began in Missouri and stretched more than 3,000 kilometers to the Willamette Valley in Oregon. Imagine thousands of wagons lined up, loaded with food, clothing, tools, and the dreams of young families. They crossed the wide prairies of Nebraska, climbed the treacherous Rocky Mountains, passed through arid deserts, facing snowstorms and disease. Every mile traveled could take someone's life. Many unmarked graves scattered along the way became grim milestones on the journey to the Promised Land. Alongside the Oregon Trail was the Santa Fe Trail, the trade route connecting Missouri with Santa Fe in New Mexico. This was not only for migrating families, but also a commercial lifeline where goods were transported back and forth between the East and the Southwest. Wagon trains carried textiles, tools, and industrial goods westward, while silver, furs, and cattle hides returned east. These routes carried not only people, but also economic, cultural, and political change. However, not everything was a story of hope. For Native Americans, those trails were like deep cuts into their land and way of life.
Every step forward by white settlers was a step backward for the tribes who had lived on those lands for generations. Hunting grounds were taken, rivers were controlled, villages were burned. The nomadic life of many tribes on the plains was disrupted as wagon trains passed by, bringing guns, disease, and foreign rules. Conflict was inevitable. Sometimes native peoples tried to negotiate, signing treaties with the U.S. government to protect the land they had left. But treaties usually lasted only a short time before being broken by new waves of migration. Other times, they rose up to resist, leading to bloody battles on the plains. But whether through negotiation or fighting, the end was usually the defeat of native peoples, for they could not withstand the military power and massive flow of settlers from the east. The westward migration also created a shift in America's identity. Americans began to see themselves not only as residents of small coastal states, but as masters of an entire continent. The spirit of adventure, courage, and even recklessness became part of the national character. Pioneers were celebrated as heroes, those who dared to leave safety to enter wilderness, build homes, cultivate land, and form new communities. But behind those heroic tales was a harsh reality. The westward journey was full of danger. Disease, especially cholera, killed thousands along the way. Many families lost children, parents, and had to bury them hastily by the roadside. Hunger was also a constant enemy, as food supplies easily ran out, while hunting or farming during the journey was nearly impossible. Winter storms could bury entire groups in snow, turning hope into despair in just one night. One famous story illustrating the brutality of westward migration was the tragedy of the Donner Party in 1846. This group of about 90 people left Missouri for California. Choosing an untested shortcut, they became trapped in the Sierra Nevada when winter arrived. With food gone, they faced hunger, cold, and ultimately, some had to resort to cannibalism to survive. Only about half reached their destination alive. That tragedy became a warning for later migrants that the dream of the Promised Land always came with a terrible price. Yet, despite the dangers, the wave of migration did not stop. People believed that if they persevered, the reward would be worth it. In the West, fertile land stretched wide. Forests were abundant, gold and silver mines lay underground waiting to be tapped. More importantly, it was a chance to start over, free from old constraints. A poor man in the East could become a landowner in the West. A family without a voice in their old community could build an entire new town. That opportunity lured hundreds of thousands, then millions, to leave home and head west. The westward migration not only changed the lives of individual families, but also transformed the U.S. economy. New towns sprang up along the routes, from small way stations to bustling cities. Trade expanded, agriculture grew, and railroads gradually appeared to link the East and West. All created a wave of development unprecedented in American history. But alongside it were undeniable dark sides. Native Americans were pushed farther away, forced to live in small areas called reservations. Their culture was destroyed, their traditional life cut off. Many once powerful tribes gradually disappeared, surviving only in memory and history books. Nature also suffered greatly. Tens of millions of bison that once roamed the plains were slaughtered for hides, meat, and to clear land for farms. Within just a few decades, their numbers dropped to only a few thousand. Looking back, the westward migration was a deeply contradictory chapter in American history. It was both a story of hope, of the desire for freedom and prosperity, and a story of tragedy, loss, and destruction. It created the image of Americans as brave pioneers, but at the same time revealed the sins of conquest and devastation. Today, when people mention the Oregon Trail or the Santa Fe Trail, many remember them as symbols of the American spirit. But we must also remember that along those trails, countless drops of sweat, tears, and blood soaked into the ground. The westward migration was not only a geographical journey, but also a moral one, forcing us to face both the light and the darkness in the history of a nation.
Westward expansion of the United States, many people often think of wagon trains crossing the prairies, new towns rising, or the gold dream in California. But hidden beneath that bright picture of hope was a very dark chapter of history. It is the story of the Indian Removal Act, of the policy that forced the natives to leave their homeland, and of the tragic journey that posterity calls by the name the Trail of Tears. At the beginning of the 19th century, the territory of the United States lay mainly east of the Mississippi River. But as the population grew rapidly and the coastal lands became crowded, many white Americans began to crave expansion westward. In their eyes, the fertile lands of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida were golden opportunities for farming and getting rich. But there was one problem: those lands were not empty. They were the homeland of tens of thousands of natives, among them 5 large tribes that Americans called the 5 civilized tribes: Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole. The reason they were called by that name was because many of them had adopted part of the European lifestyle. The Cherokee built schools, developed their own writing system, and even published newspapers in their language. The Chickasaw and Choctaw had constitutions, laws, and systems of government. They raised cattle, planted cotton, and even had slaves like many white Southerners. In every way, they showed that they could integrate and coexist with the new America. Yet in the eyes of many Southern plantation owners, all those efforts were meaningless. They only saw one thing: fertile land in the hands of the natives, and they wanted to take it. In 1828, an event changed the situation. Andrew Jackson, the general famous from the War of 1812, especially after the great victory at New Orleans, became President of the United States. Jackson strongly supported territorial expansion and saw the presence of the Indians in the Southeast as an obstacle. From his campaign, he had clearly expressed the view that the natives could not live long alongside whites and that they needed to be moved out of this land. In 1830, under Jackson's pressure, the United States Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. This law allowed the federal government to negotiate, or rather to force, the tribes to give up their ancestral lands in exchange for lands west of the Mississippi River, in what later became known as Indian Territory, that is, today's Oklahoma. On paper, the law emphasized voluntary and fair agreements, but the reality was far different. The treaties were often signed under unequal circumstances, sometimes with pressure, even deception. And when the tribes resisted, the government was ready to use force. The Choctaw were the first tribe affected. They were forced to sign the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1830, giving up millions of acres in Mississippi to migrate west. Their journey was extremely harsh. Thousands died of hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Newspapers of the time even described that heartbreaking scene as the most tragic exile in human history. But the tragedy did not stop there. After the Choctaw came the Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, and finally the Cherokee. Among the tribes, the Cherokee perhaps resisted the strongest. They tried the legal path, bringing the matter to the United States Supreme Court. In Worcester v. Georgia in 1832, Chief Justice Marshall ruled that the state of Georgia had no authority to interfere in Cherokee territory and recognized the independence of the tribe. That was a major legal victory. But Jackson, determined to carry out his plan, is said to have responded with a cold remark: "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." The federal government ignored the Supreme Court's ruling and continued the removal plan. In 1835, a small group not representing the entire Cherokee signed the Treaty of New Echota, agreeing to leave their homeland in exchange for land and money in the West. Most Cherokee opposed this treaty, but the U.S. Senate still ratified it. That was the legal excuse for the government to proceed with coercion. In 1838, the U.S. Army surrounded and forced more than 16,000 Cherokee to leave their homeland in Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. The Cherokee journey is remembered in collective memory as the Trail of Tears. They were forced to walk hundreds of miles across mountains and rivers in harsh conditions. Many had no food, warm clothing, or medicine. Diseases spread.
from measles and typhoid to dysentery. The elderly and children suffered the most. It is estimated that about 4,000 Cherokee died on that journey, nearly a quarter of the tribe's population. And the most painful thing was that they did not die in war, but on the very road they were forced to walk, leaving behind the ancestral land that had bound them for centuries. A similar story happened to the Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole. The Creek were forced to move after losing much land through unfair treaties. The Chickasaw were forced to sell their land in Mississippi and use that money to pay for their own migration westward, a bitter irony in having to pay to leave their homeland. The Seminole in Florida resisted most fiercely, leading to the Seminole War that lasted many years, costing lives on both sides. But in the end, most of them were also forced to leave. These removals not only took away land, but also destroyed the social, cultural, and spiritual structures of the native tribes. Villages were abandoned, ancestral cemeteries left behind, and the memory of homeland became a generational wound. Later generations, born and raised in Indian territory, always carried the question, why did their ancestors have to leave their sacred land? The Trail of Tears, therefore, was not only a physical journey, but also a spiritual wound that never healed. The irony is that while tens of thousands of Cherokee fell on the migration road, many white Americans saw this as a great victory. They rejoiced at having more fertile land to grow cotton, a crop that brought enormous profit to the Southern economy. Plantation owners grew richer, while the natives lost everything. The Indian Removal Act, in the eyes of many Americans then, was simply an inevitable step of manifest destiny. They believed it was God's will, that their nation was chosen by destiny to rule the continent. But to the natives, it was betrayal, proof of cruelty and limitless greed. The consequences of the Trail of Tears did not stop in the 19th century. It left a painful legacy lasting to this day. The displaced tribes had to adapt in a completely new environment, with barren land and few resources. Many communities sank into poverty, disease, and isolation. Culture, language, and traditions were eroded over time. Even today, when speaking of the Trail of Tears, many Native Americans still see it as the greatest pain in their history, a memory that never fades. The Trail of Tears also raises painful questions for U.S. history. A nation built on noble ideals like freedom, justice, and human rights, yet could ruthlessly strip away the right to live from tens of thousands of innocent people. Andrew Jackson, praised as a national hero in the eyes of many Native Americans, was the cruel man who destroyed their lives. And the Indian Removal Act, while some historians see it as an inevitable step of expansion, to many others, it is an unforgivable crime. Today, in many places across the United States, are memorials remembering the Trail of Tears. Native tribes still hold commemorations, reminding descendants of the painful journey their ancestors endured. It is not only remembrance, but also a reminder to all America that today's prosperity was built at a too high a price for others. The Trail of Tears, therefore, is not just a small chapter in westward expansion. It is a symbol of sacrifice, of injustice, and also proof of the deep contradictions in the American dream itself. For while some pursued freedom and opportunity, others were stripped away both freedom and homeland. And the question still echoes to this day. Can that be called destiny, or is it simply the justification of an invasion cloaked in ideals?
Expansion of the United States in the 19th century, many people often remember the wagon trains crossing the prairies, the pioneers searching for the promised land, or the explorers opening trails on the paths. But the truth is, most of that expansion did not just happen quietly or spontaneously. It was tied to enormous land purchases, calculated treaties, and bloody wars. Manifest destiny, the so-called obvious fate of America, was driven not only by faith and hope, but also by guns, gold, and the enormous sacrifices of many peoples. The story begins in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase, one of the largest land deals in human history. At that time, the United States had only been born for a few decades, still young and not yet fully defined in its borders. The Louisiana Territory, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, still belonged to France. But an Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, who was busy with wars in Europe and had just lost the colony of Haiti after a slave uprising, decided to sell all of Louisiana to America for only $15 million. That was a number that seemed large at that time, but in reality was an unbelievable bargain. This deal doubled the size of the United States overnight. The new land was not only rich in resources, but also opened up countless opportunities for settlement and development. With the Louisiana Purchase, America truly entered the era of territorial expansion. But buying and selling was only part of the story. Not long after, bigger problems began to appear. As Americans pushed deeper into the new lands, they had to face the powers already present there. One of those was Mexico. In the early 19th century, Mexico gained independence from Spain and controlled a vast territory, including today's Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada. With enormous land but a sparse population, Mexico struggled to manage and protect its northern border. That is why they allowed Americans to migrate to Texas, hoping these settlers would help develop the land. But that policy opened the door to a series of fierce conflicts. The Americans brought their culture, language, laws, and even slavery to Texas. This soon created tensions with the Mexican government, which had abolished slavery. As conflicts escalated, the Americans in Texas began calling for independence. The uprising broke out in 1835, with famous battles like the Battle of the Alamo, where a small group of Americans and allies resisted the much larger Mexican army. Although defeated, the courage at the Alamo became legendary, inspiring Americans to keep fighting. Finally, in 1836, Texas declared independence, becoming a separate nation called the Republic of Texas. Although Mexico did not recognize it, Texas survived for nearly a decade before joining the United States in 1845. The U.S. annexation of Texas immediately ignited war with Mexico. Mexico saw this as a blatant act of aggression. The United States at that time, under President James K. Polk, was burning with ambition to expand to the Pacific. Polk was a devout believer in the idea of manifest destiny. He believed that the United States not only had the right, but also the sacred duty to expand its territory, bringing civilization and democracy across the North American continent. That is why when conflicts erupted on the Texas border, Polk saw it as the opportunity to fulfill the dream. In 1846, the Mexican-American War broke out. This was an unequal war. The U.S. Army was better trained and equipped, while Mexico, having just gained independence, had a weak government and lacked resources. Within 2 years, the Americans won consecutive victories. They captured New Mexico, California, and even advanced into Mexico City itself. In 1848, the war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Under this treaty, Mexico was forced to cede to the United States a vast territory, including all of California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, along with part of Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming. In return, the U.S. paid Mexico $15 million and promised to protect the rights of Mexican residents in the new land. But in reality, many Mexicans lost land, faced discrimination, and became second-class citizens in their own homeland. The result of the war with Mexico profoundly changed the map of North America. The United States had nearly completed the dream of stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. California, with its long coastline and important ports, quickly became America's gateway to the Pacific, opening opportunities for trade with Asia. The new land also contained many untapped resources, from gold and silver to fertile farmland. But along with expansion, major debates also erupted within the United States. One of the biggest debates was the issue of slavery. Would the new territories allow slavery to exist or not? This was not only a question of economics, but also one of morality and politics, about the future of the nation itself. Many Southerners wanted to expand slavery into the new lands to maintain economic interests. Meanwhile, many Northerners opposed it, seeing it as a threat to freedom and equality. This growing division planted the seeds for the bloody Civil War just a decade later. Not only through war with Mexico, the United States also used many other forms to expand its territory. In 1819, America signed the Adams-Onis Treaty with Spain, thereby purchasing Florida. In 1846, the U.S. signed a treaty with Britain, dividing the Oregon Territory along the 49th parallel, gaining control of today's Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. These agreements, though less bloody, still clearly reflected the determination of the United States to expand territory at all costs. Even after gaining California, the U.S. did not stop. In 1854, through the Gadsden Purchase, the United States bought another small portion of land from Mexico, now southern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico, to complete the southern border and serve the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. These purchases seemed like small details, but in reality, they were the final bricks laying the foundation for the U.S. map as we see it today. But every step of expansion, whether through purchase or war, came at a price. For Mexico, that price was losing nearly half its territory. For Native Americans, that price was an irreparable loss. The new lands were not empty. They were the homelands of hundreds of native tribes with cultures and traditions thousands of years old. When the United States took territory from France, Spain, Britain, or Mexico, they not only took land from those nations, but also from the natives. The bloody frontier conflicts, the broken treaties, and the silent genocides became a dark part of the expansion journey. For the United States internally, the purchases and wars were not always unanimously supported. Many northern politicians opposed the war with Mexico, seeing it as an invasion war meant to expand slavery. A young congressman named Abraham Lincoln, later to become president, spoke out questioning the legitimacy of the war, asking whether President Polk truly had just cause to drag the whole country into conflict. Those opposing voices showed that manifest destiny was not always a common belief of all Americans. It was an idea that both inspired and divided. In conclusion, this history of purchases and wars shows that manifest destiny was not just dreams and hopes written on paper. It was built through enormous land deals, through fierce battles, and through countless lives. The Louisiana Purchase, the Texas Annexation, the Mexican-American War, the Oregon Treaty, the Gadsden Purchase. All these events redrew the map of America, turning this young nation into a continental power. But at the same time, they also left deep wounds, both within the United States and upon the peoples who had to sacrifice.
Remote land of the American West, an accidental discovery shook the whole world. That was when a carpenter named James W. Marshall found glittering pieces of gold at the construction site of John Sutter's sawmill near Coloma by the American River in California. Marshall had no idea that that moment would begin one of the largest migrations in the history of the United States, opening an era when hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world poured into the wilderness to seek their fortune. People called that era the California Gold Rush, a storm that not only changed the destiny of the state of California, but also reshaped the entire United States. At first, news of the gold discovery spread only within a small circle. John Sutter, the landowner, even wanted to keep it secret, fearing the gold seekers would flood his land and destroy his dream of building a vast farm. But like all secrets about gold in history, this news quickly escaped control. Soon, local newspapers reported it, and it spread across the West Coast. By the end of 1848, even big cities in the East, such as New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, were buzzing with stories about the promised land of California. And when that news crossed the ocean, it touched the dreams of thousands of people from Mexico, Chile, China, and even Europe. A massive wave of migration began to form. Within just 1 year, the wave of gold seekers, often called the 49ers, the people of 1849, transformed California from a sparsely populated land into the center of global attention. They came by many different routes. Some crossed treacherous mountains and harsh deserts from east to west by wagon. Others chose the sea route, sailing around Cape Horn in South America, a long and dangerous journey lasting months. Some went through the Isthmus of Panama, crossing tropical jungles, enduring malaria and disease, then boarding ships to continue their journey to California's coast. However they came, all carried in their hearts a strong belief that just by finding a few pieces of gold, their lives would change forever. When they arrived, they realized that the dream was never easy. The golden fields they imagined were not spread out before them. Gold seekers had to live in makeshift camps, endure harsh weather, and suffer food shortages. By day, they immersed themselves in rivers, patiently panning handfuls of sand, hoping to find tiny specks of gold. By night, they returned exhausted, often empty-handed. Some were lucky enough to strike gold and change their lives overnight, but most, thousands of others, sank into disappointment, losing all their money, strength, and even their lives to disease, accidents, or conflicts. The gold rush brought not only hope, but also chaos. Mining towns sprang up like mushrooms along rivers and canyons. Places that were once wilderness became trading centers, where saloons, gambling houses, barber shops, and brothels competed to serve the gold seekers. San Francisco was the clearest example. From a tiny fishing village with just a few hundred people, in just a few years, San Francisco turned into a bustling city with tens of thousands of residents. Ships full of people and goods arrived at its port every day, so many that the harbor became clogged with hundreds of abandoned ships because sailors too deserted to seek gold. Yet behind this bustling picture lay a dark reality. The native Californians, who had lived on this land for thousands of years, became the most tragic victims of the gold rush. Before Americans and immigrants poured in, California had about 300,000 natives. But within 2 decades, that number dropped to less than 1/3. They were driven from their ancestral lands, killed in conflicts, or died from strange diseases they had never known. Many tribes disappeared completely from humanity's map, taking with them languages, customs, and ancestral memories. Not only natives, but also immigrants faced discrimination and violence. The Chinese, one of the largest immigrant groups during the gold rush, came to California believing they could work hard and find a chance to change their lives. They built camps, opened shops, and joined the hunt for gold. But soon they became targets of hatred. Many unfair laws were enacted, imposing heavy taxes only on Chinese miners, preventing them from accessing the best gold mines. Many were attacked, robbed, or even killed simply because they were different in skin color and customs. Mexicans and South Americans suffered similar fates, treated as unwanted competitors in the brutal hunt for gold. Meanwhile, merchants and businessmen were the ones who truly got rich from the gold rush. Traders sold mining tools, clothes, food, and liquor at exorbitant prices to the miners. A simple shovel could be sold for 10 times its real value. A pair of shoes, a bowl of soup, even a piece of cloth became highly valuable in remote mining camps. The famous saying, "The people who sold shovels got richer than the ones who dug for gold," was born in this era. Levi Strauss, the founder of the Levi's jeans brand, was a prime example. He made his fortune not from gold, but from durable pants for miners. The impact of the California gold rush was not limited to the economy. It also changed the social and political structure of the United States. The sudden population boom pushed California to quickly become an official state in 1850, just 2 years after America signed the treaty with Mexico to acquire the land. This was an unprecedented pace in history and showed the power of migration. However, California's entry into the Union also intensified the debate over slavery, which was deeply dividing America at the time. California entered as a free state, rejecting slavery, which made the political balance between the North and South more tense than ever, contributing to the Civil War a few years later. In addition, the gold rush marked a turning point in infrastructure development. With hundreds of thousands pouring into California, the demand for roads, ports, and transportation services became urgent. Shipping routes, postal services, and later the Transcontinental Railroad were all driven by the needs of trade and travel from this era. In other words, the gold rush transformed the West from a strange land into an inseparable part of America's economy and identity. But the most important thing it left behind was a dream, a deep belief in the possibility of changing one's life overnight. The image of glittering gold bars became a symbol of opportunity and aspiration. It engraved into the American mind the idea that anyone, no matter how poor their beginnings, could change their destiny with courage and risk-taking. Even though most gold seekers left empty-handed, their spirit, along with the rare success stories, helped shape the American dream that the whole world knows today. Today, when people mention the California gold rush, they remember not only the gold specks in the riverbeds, but also a chaotic yet explosive era where hope and despair went hand in hand, where dreams and tragedies intertwined. It is proof of the power of human ambition, but also a reminder of the price to be paid when a great dream sweeps through and takes away countless innocent lives, cultures, and lands of native peoples. The California Gold Rush is an indispensable chapter when talking about manifest destiny, because it most clearly reflects both the bright and dark sides of the obvious fate. It brought wealth and development to America, but at the same time sowed tragedy for millions. And from it, America entered a new era with resounding successes, but also with wounds that have never fully healed.
In the 19th century, America went through profound transformations. From the small colonies along the Atlantic coast, this young nation had expanded its territory all the way to California, thanks to land purchases, wars, and waves of migration. Yet there was one great problem: the enormous geographical distance. From New York on the east coast to San Francisco on the west coast was more than 4,000 kilometers. To travel from one to the other, people had to spend many months crossing plains, mountains, deserts, or taking the dangerous sea route around South America. The need to connect the two coasts of the country became more urgent than ever. And so a dream was born, the dream of a transcontinental railroad. The idea of a railroad linking East and West had been discussed since the 1830s, but at that time it seemed like an impossibility. Technology was still limited, finances were lacking, and the treacherous terrain made many skeptical. However, when the California Gold Rush erupted in 1848, hundreds of thousands of people poured into the West. California developed rapidly, but remained isolated from the rest of the country. Transporting goods, mail, and soldiers all took far too long. Politicians and businessmen realized that if the two coasts could be connected by rail, not only would travel be shortened, but both the economy and national security would be strengthened. That dream began to take real shape. In 1862, while the American Civil War was raging, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act, authorizing the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. The government promised to support the effort with land and bonds for the companies involved. Two major companies were assigned the task: Union Pacific, starting from Omaha, Nebraska, heading west, and Central Pacific, starting from Sacramento, California, heading east. The two lines would meet somewhere on the plains of Utah. It was one of the greatest infrastructure projects of the 19th century, hailed as an engineering marvel of America. The road was anything but easy. Union Pacific, which began in 1865, faced vast prairies where storms and strong winds toppled wagons. The workers labored in harsh conditions, lacking food and clean water. They were frequently attacked by native tribes on the plains, who saw the railroad as the ultimate threat to their way of life and the buffalo herds that sustained them. Every kilometer of track laid was a battle for survival, not only against nature, but also against cultural conflict and bloodshed. On the other side, Central Pacific faced another enemy, the mighty yet treacherous Sierra Nevada mountains. The railroad had to cross steep cliffs and cut through hard rock canyons. Tunneling work in that era was extremely dangerous. Crude explosives, hand drills, and the sweat of thousands of laborers were all they had. Most of Central Pacific's workforce was Chinese immigrants. At first, many Americans doubted them. Some considered them small, weak, and unfit for heavy labor. But reality proved otherwise. Thousands of Chinese workers became the backbone of the project, working tirelessly, with discipline, even risking their lives hanging from cliffs to place explosives. They were paid less than white laborers and suffered discrimination, but it was their effort that helped turn the dream into reality. The climate was also a ruthless enemy. In winter, heavy snow buried the Sierra Nevada, some years piling up more than 10 meters. Many groups of workers were swallowed by blizzards, never to return. In summer, blazing sun and sandstorms tormented workers on the plains. They labored from dawn to dusk amid the pounding of hammers, drills, explosions, and the cries of hunger and disease. Thousands died along the unfinished track, and no one knows the exact number. Even so, the project pressed forward. The companies raced each other for every mile of track, since each completed kilometer earned them land and money from the government. Union Pacific sped ahead, laying several kilometers of track per day, while Central Pacific, though facing tougher challenges, refused to fall behind, clinging to the Rocky Mountains. The first trains began test runs on the completed sections, carrying the hope that the day the first transcontinental train rolled out was not far away. On May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah, the two railroads met. The completion ceremony was held with great solemnity, witnessed by officials, businessmen, and workers. A golden spike, called the Golden Spike, was driven to mark the historic moment. When the hammer struck the spike, the whole nation seemed to hold its breath. It was not just an engineering event, but a symbol of a country now fully connected from the Atlantic to the Pacific. For the first time in history, one could travel from the East Coast to the West Coast in just a few days instead of months. The transcontinental dream had come true. The Transcontinental Railroad brought enormous impact. It boosted trade, allowing goods, weapons, food, and mail to move faster than ever. Cities sprang up along the route, becoming new economic centers. Farmers could bring wheat, meat, and cotton to markets in the East. In return, machinery, industrial goods, culture, and people from the East poured into the West. California and the Western states were no longer isolated, but became an integral part of the national economy. But like every great dream, the Transcontinental Railroad came at a price. First was the price paid in blood by Chinese immigrants, Irish workers, African Americans, and even Native Americans forced into labor. They were the nameless, faceless ones in history books, but their sweat and blood seeped into every tie and steel rail. They died in accidents, snowstorms, and disease, and most were never properly remembered. Second was the price paid by native peoples. The railroad cut through the homelands of many plains tribes, where the buffalo herds were their lifeline. As trains thundered by, hunters on board would shoot buffalo for sport. Within just a few decades, millions of buffalo vanished, bringing the collapse of native nomadic life. Many tribes starved, were forced to sign unfair treaties, or driven onto reservations. To white Americans, the railroad was a symbol of civilization, but to native peoples, it was a giant coffin burying their culture. Third were the environmental consequences. Forests were cut down for railroad ties, iron and steel were mined massively, and the land was transformed. Railroads brought mining, urban expansion, and nature's devastation. For the 19th century, that was considered a small price for wealth, but the long-term consequences left scars that cannot be erased. Yet, it cannot be denied that the Transcontinental Railroad helped elevate America into a world power. It created a unified market, moved goods, spurred industrialization, and made America a nation able to exploit resources spanning the continent. It also reinforced belief in manifest destiny, the conviction that Americans' destiny was to conquer and connect the entire continent. Today, looking back at the Transcontinental Railroad, we see both of its faces. On one side, an engineering marvel, a symbol of human ambition and willpower. On the other, a tragedy, where the blood, sweat, and cultures of vulnerable communities were sacrificed. Those rails carried both dreams and sorrow. And that is the essence of history, where glory and pain always walk side by side.
When the westward expansion was nearly complete, Americans held their heads high, believing they had successfully fulfilled the sacred mission called Manifest Destiny. From a narrow strip of land on the Atlantic coast, the nation now stretched all the way to the Pacific. Yet behind that pride, behind the roads and the new cities that sprang up, lay layers of darkness, of tragedies and irreparable losses. Manifest Destiny was like a double-edged sword. It brought both opportunity and wealth, but also spread suffering and destruction. And this is why, even today, historians continue to debate, was Manifest Destiny a noble vision or merely a disguise for imperialism? First, let us look at the positive impacts this movement left behind. It cannot be denied that territorial expansion helped the United States become a true world power. The vast lands stretching from the Midwest to the Pacific coast opened opportunities for large-scale agriculture, mining, trade, and the creation of new trade routes. The endless fields in Kansas, Nebraska, and the Great Plains became wheat and corn belts that fed a rapidly growing nation. The gold mines in California, silver mines in Nevada, coal mines in the Appalachians, and later oil in Texas provided enormous resources that propelled America onto the path of industrialization. People often say that without Manifest Destiny, America might not have become the world's strongest economy in just over a century. Not only that, expansion also created opportunities for millions of immigrants from all over the world to find a new home. The Irish fleeing the potato famine, the Germans seeking freedom, the Chinese crossing the ocean for a better life, all poured into the promised land called America. They contributed to the multi-ethnic, multicultural identity of the United States today. The railroads, the towns, the cities, the farms all bore their mark. From this perspective, Manifest Destiny can be seen as an economic and social miracle, fueling a population boom, driving economic growth, and shaping the American dream admired worldwide. Yet it was also from Manifest Destiny that the deepest wounds in American history were formed. For Native Americans, this expansion was nothing less than a death sentence for their culture and survival. From the early 19th century, numerous treaties were signed between the U.S. government and Native tribes, but most of those treaties existed only on paper. When whites needed land, when gold was discovered, or when a railroad needed to pass through, every promise was broken. Natives were pushed farther and farther from the east to the Midwest, then from the Midwest to the barren lands of the West. Lands once promised as forever belonging to the Indians lasted only a few years before being taken away. The consequences of these displacements were tens of thousands of deaths along the way, the collapse of hundreds of tribes, and millions of fertile acres falling into the hands of new settlers. Not only did Native peoples lose land, but also culture, language, and faith. Villages were burned, hunting grounds erased, and buffalo herds, the lifeline of many tribes, were slaughtered nearly to extinction, either for hides or simply to clear the way for trains. It is estimated that when Christopher Columbus arrived in the Americas, the native population of North America may have been in the tens of millions. But by the end of the 19th century, after centuries of disease, war, and relentless encroachment, only a few 100,000 remained. It was a massive humanitarian disaster, and its scars remain deeply imprinted in American society to this day. Not only natives, but many immigrant groups also paid terrible prices during expansion. Consider the Chinese laborers who built the Transcontinental Railroad. They worked under harsh conditions, facing snow on the Sierra Nevada, dynamite blasts cutting through mountains, and the prejudice and discrimination of American society at the time. Thousands of them died, their names never recorded in history. Meanwhile, the first white passengers riding across the continent were celebrated as symbols of civilization's great triumph. In addition, Manifest Destiny also ignited heated moral and political debates within the United States itself. Many saw it as an expression of freedom, of ambition, but many others recognized the cruelty and injustice it carried.
In particular, each new territory acquired came with a burning question: would slavery be allowed there or not? This debate fueled the growing divide between North and South, ultimately leading to the bloody Civil War from 1861 to 1865. One could say that Manifest Destiny not only shaped America's map, but also indirectly contributed to the greatest war in its history. Today, when looking back, historians remain divided in evaluating Manifest Destiny. Some argue it was an inevitable step in history, that territorial expansion was necessary for America's survival and growth, that every empire in history had to expand, and the United States was no exception. But others voice strong criticism, saying Manifest Destiny was a religiously cloaked excuse, that calling it divine destiny was nothing but a cover for conquest, plunder, and destruction. If you listen to Native communities today, you will find the pain has never truly faded. They speak of lost ancestral lands, of cemeteries erased, of sacred temples destroyed. They recall forced assimilation policies, when Native children were taken from their families to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their language, forced to forget their own culture. To them, Manifest Destiny was not a guiding light, but a darkness that lasted for generations. For white Americans, however, the memory of Manifest Destiny is often told in a romantic and heroic tone. They recall the wagon trains carrying families towards the horizon, the small towns rising in the desert, the trains crossing mountains and rivers carrying faith and hope. It is a story of resilience, of the pursuit of wealth, of the will to conquer nature. But the striking fact is that these two narratives, one of the victors and one of the conquered, exist side by side, in opposition, never able to reconcile. Perhaps this is why Manifest Destiny remains an endlessly debated subject. It is both pride and haunting. It is both proof of America's rise as a world power and a bitter reminder that every dream carries a price. In the dust of history, the railroads and bustling cities still stand as symbols of success. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the cries of those left behind. In conclusion, when speaking of Manifest Destiny, we cannot look only at the glory of America's rise as a world power. We must also confront the shadows it left behind, the wounds that never healed, and the profound lessons about ambition, justice, and humanity. For only by acknowledging both sides can we truly understand the meaning of one of the most important and controversial chapters in American history.
The story of Manifest Destiny does not stop at the dry pages of history books. It is like a deep scar in the soul of America, where the glory of expansion always walked side by side with the darkness of blood and tears. When speaking of Manifest Destiny, many people immediately think of a noble ideal, a strong belief that this nation was destined to stretch across the continent. Indeed, that ideal transformed the United States from a collection of 13 small states on the Atlantic coast into a great power, spanning from the East Coast to the far west, where the Pacific Ocean roars with waves. Yet, to achieve today's vast map, the price that America and the people who once lived on this land had to pay was by no means small. Try to picture it. On the vast fields of the Midwest, there once were lively native villages, traditional ceremonies and stories told by the fire. But then everything vanished within just a few decades. Tribes were forced from their ancestral homelands, compelled to walk hundreds of miles along the Trail of Tears, leaving behind the graves of their forefathers and the childhoods of their children. Tears mixed with rain and wind, cries drowned in the sound of soldiers' horses. Behind the beautiful slogan of Manifest Destiny were the laments that history has often tried to cover up. Yet we also cannot deny that it was because of this dream that America became the promised land for millions of immigrants. They came from Ireland, Germany, China, Mexico, and even farther away. They set foot at the ports of New York, then followed trains and wagons deep into the continent. They carried with them hope of escaping poverty, war, and oppression. For them,
Manifest destiny was not just a political concept, but a chance to rebuild their lives. From that wave of immigrants, new towns were born, bustling cities grew, and endless fields became symbols of a rising economy. But between that light and shadow, the great question still holds. What exactly was manifest destiny? Was it a gift from God, or merely an excuse to justify territorial ambition? Historians to this day have not found a unified answer. Some argue that without manifest destiny, America could hardly have become the global power it is today. But others counter that every glory achieved was built upon the pain of erased communities, buried cultures, and voices forever silenced. It is this contradiction that has made manifest destiny a subject of endless debate. When we look at the map of modern America, we see a strong, diverse, and vibrant country. But if we look deeper, we also see wounds that never fully healed. The land issues of Native people, racial discrimination, and the memory of territorial wars remain as ghosts hidden in America's heart. What is notable is that this story does not belong only to the past. It is also a reminder for the present and the future. Because any great dream of humanity always comes with a price. The most important question is not whether we should pursue the dream, but whether we are ready to face the price. Manifest destiny taught the world a costly lesson. When a nation believes it has a sacred mission above all others, that belief sometimes blinds it to the faint voices that need to be heard. And now, after traveling through this story, perhaps you have found your own perspective. You may admire the determination of wagon trains daring to cross barren deserts in search of the promised land. You may also feel the pain imagining Native children forced to leave homes they had not yet grown up in. You may see glory in victory, but also hear the echoes of grief. All of it blends into a sorrowful yet unforgettable melody in American history. So, what is manifest destiny to you? A noble vision, or a tragedy hidden beneath the cloak of ideals? History does not force us to choose a single answer, but history demands that we reflect, so that we can better understand the price of expansion and the true value of freedom. Before closing, I invite you to continue the journey with us, because America is not only glorious triumphs or radiant dreams, it also has forgotten stories, hidden truths, and tragedies buried deep in its soil. Hit subscribe to the US History channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss upcoming episodes where we will uncover other chapters of history, sometimes epic, sometimes tragic, but always captivating and meaningful for the present. The story of manifest destiny has ended, but its echoes still resound. It reminds us that history is never only the past. It is a mirror of the present and a warning for the future. And now, after traveling through this story, perhaps you have found your own perspective. You may admire the determination of wagon trains daring to cross barren deserts in search of the promised land. You may also feel the pain imagining Native children forced to leave homes they had not yet grown up in. You may see glory in victory, but also hear the echoes of grief. All of it blends into a sorrowful yet unforgettable melody in American history.